I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Christopher Spann. I am a professor in the College of Education at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a historian of education with an emphasis on the African-American educational experience. And I am also the Chief of Staff for the Chancellor at the University of Illinois and Associate Chancellor for Administration and Pre-K through 12 initiatives. And it's my distinct honor to be the moderator of this important discussion that we're going to have with our esteemed colleague, Marybeth Gasman. Before we get to an introduction of Marybeth and her book, which we're going to have a conversation about, I'd like to thank our sponsor for this event, the Samuel D. Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice at Rutgers University. And I also would like very much to introduce really the star of our show, fellow friend and historian, colleague, Marybeth Gasman. Marybeth is the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Endowed Chair and Distinguished Professor in the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers University. She also serves as the Executive Director of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice, and the Executive Director of the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions. Her areas of expertise include the history of American higher education, minority serving institutions, MSIs, with an emphasis on historically Black colleges and universities. She also is an expert in dealing with the issues on these campuses surrounding racism and diversity, fundraising and philanthropy, and higher education leadership. Marybeth has authored or edited over 30 books, including this one that we're going to be talking about today, Doing the Right Thing. And she's penned over 450 opinion articles in the nation's newspapers and magazines. She's been recently listed as by Education Week as the 32nd most important person in the list of top 200 most influential public scholars. And I dare to find 31 people more impressive than our colleague here, Marybeth Gasman. That being said, I look forward to serving as her moderator as well as fellow panelists in this important conversation. And I'd like to introduce the event, which is essentially her most recent book. Her latest book, Doing the Right Thing, How Colleges and Universities Can Undo Systemic Racism in Faculty Hiring, takes a hard look at systemic racism and the biases in faculty hiring. And it's in this sense that we're going to have an hour-long conversation, maybe a little bit longer than that, with the Q&A of what motivated Marybeth to write this book, why she was feel inspired to go and tell it in not only this format, but as we go forward, and to hopefully hear from others who are in this session as to how they think about both the topic as well as the discussions of the book. One thing that you can do is the book, which is published by Princeton University Press, its release date is going to be June 14th, which actually was yesterday. And so in this regard, so if you haven't got a copy, I encourage you to get a copy. And I would probably encourage, if we can, to put in the chat here where you can actually get the book, and not only get the book, but get the book with a 30% discount if you type in the code PSDRT. And so I see the link is now in the chat in this regard. So I've read the book. I'm inspired by it, and I highly encourage everyone to go out and purchase the book and buy it as well. It's beyond an easy read with regards to it being relatable and accessible for the average reader in the field, but particularly for anyone in higher education who's trying to rethink the way we think hiring practices of our faculty across this nation. So with that, I'd like to honestly just open it up for conversation here with our colleague. And I'm going to start with both a question as well as a request for a definition, if you don't mind, Marybeth. First, how are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm happy to be here with you, Chris.
No, excellent. So what I'd like to ask first is, why this book? Why now? But before you answer that, I was hoping if you can get us started with at least a definition of probably the most important thing people are going to pick up in the subtitle of your book, a definition of systemic racism. So what is systemic racism? And then can you offer that, but also give us a sense as to why this book, why now?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. I'm really excited about this. And for those of you who might follow me on social media, I've mentioned that this book was really like soul writing for me. And I'm really, really excited about it. Probably the hardest book that I've ever written. So first of all, I do think it's really important that everybody understands what systemic racism is. And that is, systemic or structural racism, sometimes called institutional racism. Those are forms of racism that are pervasively and deeply embedded in systems, laws, written or unwritten policies, entrenched practices, beliefs, and attitudes that produce, condone, and perpetuate, I want to emphasize, widespread unfair treatment of people of color. And so we're not really going to be talking about individual racism very much today. We're going to be talking about how these systems are in place within our colleges and universities that end up perpetuating racism and some things we need to do about it. So, and then in terms of why this book, why now? So, I will say that for a long, long time, I've mainly done research related to minority serving institutions and historically Black colleges in particular. And over the years, I've written a few articles here and there related to maybe diversity in leadership of colleges and universities, majority ones, or maybe the experiences of students of color. And that was basically based on my own experiences working with students of color over the years. But I have to say that the reason why I decided to write this book, it goes back to in 2016, I was invited to be a speaker at the New York Times Higher Education Forum. And I was on stage with a graduate of Xavier University who was now a doctor, and Nicole Hannah-Jones, who at that point was well known, but not as well known as since writing the 1619 Project. And so I was on stage with both of them talking about historically Black colleges and minority serving institutions. And I think I brought up the fact that historically Black colleges have some of the most diverse faculties in the country, and that, we often don't think that, but it's the truth. They have very diverse faculties. And I said, unlike most majority institutions, and Nicole Hannah-Jones responded with, she kind of turned the tables a bit, and she said, now, why is that that most majority institutions don't have a diverse faculty? And she said highly selective ones. And so my answer to her was, well, frankly, because we don't want to. We don't want that, right? And what the reason why I answered that way is because I believe if we really wanted a diverse faculty, we'd have it. Because what I know more than anything else is, as a person, if I want something, I'm going to find a way to get it. And if I really, really wanted faculty diversity, I think people would have it. And so I after that, someone came up to me at a cocktail party that the New York Times was hosting and said, would you put that in writing? And so I said, okay, fine. So I wrote an op-ed. It was first published in the Hechinger Report, and then the Washington Post picked it up, and it sort of went viral. So an interesting thing happened when it went viral. And that is that I received somewhere, last count, I think a little over 6,000 emails from people across the country. And most of the emails were from people of color who had been trying to get jobs for years and years and years and could not get faculty jobs. And I mean, these were gut-wrenching emails, people sending me their CVs, people, anything, could you help me? Maybe you have a connection. I would say I also received a lot of emails from people who told me I was one of these people who was sort of like a guard dog against diversity, but I've changed, and here's why I changed. So I received some of those. And then I will say that I received some pretty vile emails from people. And I do want to point out that the vile emails were mainly about Black academics. So all of the vileness was directed toward Black people. And, that really gets at the anti-Blackness in our country. And so I had all that information, and I decided, you know what, I really want to look deeper at this. And so at that point, I decided to design a study, and just decided that I wanted to do this. And normally once I decide to do something, I do it. And I will tell you, it was really interesting to write this because I had the entire book written before George Floyd was murdered. Okay, the entire book. And I had to go back after that happened. I went back, and I couldn't publish this book without mentioning everything that was changing and happening, and all of what was taking place in the country. So I went back and did a rewrite of it. And so it's interesting because I had written, I'd handed it in to my editor at Princeton before the atrocity of the George Floyd murder. And so it was really interesting to be just, and you probably remember all the stuff that was happening, right? Just nonstop with Black people being killed. And so that was all happening, and I was rewriting during that whole process. So I will say that thinking about why this book, why now, it was really daunting to watch all that happen in real time and watch universities finally admit, and I'm not even sure if they fully admitted it, but start to admit that there were race issues on their campuses. Because, prior to that, there was a survey done by Inside Higher Ed that asked presidents whether or not they had race issues on their campuses, and most of them said no, which I talk about in the book, so most of them said no. And even today, most presidents of college and universities don't think that they have any kind of chronic racial issues on their campuses, which to me, I think that's a bit of a blind spot.
Wow.
So that's the why this book, why now?
Wow. And I appreciate you sharing that. There was the book was in production, actually drafted prior to George Floyd, but the necessity to go back and have deep intentionality as to how do we now begin to rethink this moment that has happened in American history, and how institutions of higher education are trying to do the right thing, which is the title of your book, right? One thing I will say is I have an opportunity to read the book is it's beyond impressively researched. And I was hoping that you can give those in the audience here a sense as to how you went about doing the research for this book. And more importantly, I really honed in on your opportunities to talk to different people throughout the book so you can gain better understanding and meaning of what you're writing. So how did you go about researching the book, and who did you talk to in the book?
Sure. So, well, first of all, I'm glad that you liked it. And I did want to say to everyone that I purposely wrote a book that anybody can pick up, that you don't have to be a scholar to pick up, that anyone can pick up. And I'm hoping practitioners will pick it up. And I just wrote it as if we were having a conversation. Yes, it's filled with data, but I think I made it so that you can really easily interact with the data. So I tried to do as much research as possible. And the reason is because of course, people are going to find issues. They always do, but I will say I wanted to have my arguments be as airtight as possible. And so I'll tell you what I did. I first of all, I had all of the confidential data of emails from individuals across the country when I wrote that op-ed piece for the Washington Post. So of course I didn't use anyone's names, but I could do a sort of a coding of that data and take a look at what were the most dominant issues in that data. So the other thing that I had was I did over 100, I think nearly 100 interviews. They were about an hour long with provosts, deans, search committee chairs, department chairs, and often vice provosts for faculty or vice provosts for diversity at the AAU schools. So those are the American Association of Universities, and it's Association of American Universities, I think. And basically, those are the most highly selective research universities in the country. And the reason there are 63 of them, and the reason why I chose them is because they are the institutions that are most likely to prepare faculty. And as we're talking, you'll see that there is an absolute bias among search committees for people who have PhDs from those institutions. And I'm going to show you why that is troubling in and of itself. Okay, so I did interviews across all of those institutions. They are all anonymous. And I will also tell you that the interviews, I don't say which of the institutions I interviewed, because when you read the book, you see what people told me, and there is no way they would have told me what they told me if I had identified them. They just wouldn't have. So I am the only person who knows who told me what. I didn't use any, like a lot of times people would assume that I, had research assistants looking at it. Nothing. I did all of the review of data myself, and no one has seen the data except for me. And I had to really get people to trust me in order to do that. The other thing I did is I used National Science Foundation data, the survey of earned doctorates, so that I could write a chapter about the pipelines to the faculty. I also used the National Center for Educational Statistics, IPEDS data, so that I could give people a real understanding of diversity among the faculty, especially at these highly selective research institutions. And then another thing I did is, because I always want to honor people who've gone before me. I think that's so important. As a historian, you can imagine it's so important. For us, it would be, like a historiography, right? We want to look at who has done the work before us. And so I kind of identified experts in the field across a variety of topics that I was addressing. And I either interviewed them or I employed their work, a lot throughout the book. Just kind of like, for example, one of your colleagues, James Anderson, has done such important work. He wrote this piece years ago that has to do with how institutions fundamentally will do almost anything not to hire, in that case, it was African Americans, right, faculty. And so I really employed that. I employed experts like Lauren Rivera, who authored the book Pedigree, which I would recommend to everyone, Julie Passault, who's done amazing work inside graduate admissions, Daryl Smith, who's done wonderful work in her book Diversity in Higher Education, just a whole variety of people. There are lots of people, including lots of people of color, who have done this kind of parts of this work, and I wanted to really reach out to them and to engage with their work. So that was another thing, right? It's not just doing this work out on its own. You have to spend a lot of time reading what's gone before you. That's incredibly important. So, yep.
That is beyond, like I said, the depth. It's self-evident, the depth of research that went into the book, and how not only were you able to mine it, but to collate it and really give meaning to it. It's beyond impressive. And I think, again, when you think about the timing of this book, everyone is talking about diversity, particularly in the wake of George Floyd. And part of that, the new discussions around diversity is being demanded by everyday people, demanding that this nation recognize their personhood, whatever that means, right, in this regard. And when you think about this conversation of everyone talking about diversity, in some ways, one population does seem to not have an open conversation about it, which is faculty. And here, your book kind of introduces what these issues are as it relates to faculty and hiring. And I was wondering, what does the landscape look like in terms of faculty across this country? Because we talk about diversity, we all show an appreciation for diversity, but there's talk and then there's the walk. And so have we done the walk after the talk? What does the landscape look like for faculty in this country?
Sure. And just before I answer that, one thing I was going to say is that one other data source that I used in the book is I did do an appendix on law schools, because law schools are even more it's, the disparities are even more pervasive. So I did look at law schools because as I was talking to people, it seemed like there was so much trouble in law schools. And so I did an appendix that is at the end of the book as well, based on law schools. I just wanted to make sure people knew that too. So if we look overall in the country, not just at these AAU institutions, but overall, you're going to see right now that the faculty, college and university faculty is 76% white, with the majority of those individuals being men. And then, you have about 6% Black faculty, 6% Latinx faculty, 12% Asian American, Pacific Islander, leaning more toward Asian American, 1% Native American, and 1% two or more races. Now, within these AAU institutions, you tend to see they tend to be a little bit more diverse at the assistant level professors. So they're around 70% white. Okay, that's still not that diverse, but I'm just saying, like, they're about 70% white. But if you look at the tenured level, you're seeing that go up to about 78% white. And then you end up with, basically about 6% Black, 6% Latinx, and then it ends up hovering around 13% AAPI. And then again, you're going to have lower numbers of Native Americans, Native Alaskans, and two or more races. So that's kind of what the landscape looks like right now. You are seeing a slight change happening, but it's very slow. It's very, very slow, especially for the Latinx population and the Black population. It's a very slow change.
Is the reason it's slow because there aren't any graduate students who are African American or Latino in the pipeline?
So this is a great question, and I wrote an entire chapter about this because that is the number one thing whenever I'm giving a talk that people are like, well, we just can't find them, right? They're not out there. Well, that's actually not true. There are, and I present data across nearly every discipline in the book so that people can look. There are disciplines where there are limited numbers of people of color. For example, physics, right? Philosophy. But part of that is because within those departments, they have not been doing the work that needs to be done to cultivate graduate students in that area. I will say, though, even in areas that have many people of color, so let's say biology, education, the humanities over English, right? The humanities overall, you still are not seeing a large influx of people of color into faculty positions. I will say, with the exception of one area, and that's ethnic studies. All folks of color have equitable representation in ethnic studies. But outside of ethnic studies, there isn't equitable representation. And so part of that has to do with something that we'll talk a little bit more about as well. But one of the issues is that if you did not receive your PhD from an AAU institution, it is really, really tough to get a position at an AAU institution, meaning, a major highly selective research institution. It is really, really tough because there are these pervasive biases, which, we're going to get into. But, and so if you're definitely seeing people of color getting PhDs, but they're tending to get PhDs at non-AAU institutions, which is limiting where they can go because of the systemic biases that we have as faculty, especially at research institutions. And I will say, even at the non-AAU institutions, there's still a preference for PhDs from AAU institutions. So now that really is hurting Black and brown people, because there are fewer of them attending AAU institution PhD programs. So this is just an issue that is like a cycle, right? Although I will say there are people out there, and there are people in the pipeline who are not getting jobs. And, they're one of the issues is that people think, oh, well, we can't afford people of color, they're in a bidding war. But Daryl Smith, one of the people who I talked with, and through her really comprehensive research, has shown that there isn't a bidding war. There
Mhm.
is people of color are not being offered 10 jobs. They're even people who have received highly prestigious fellowships are not being offered many jobs. This is really a myth. It's a fallacy. And it's a way to say to people, well, you know, we can't even go after them because we'll never get them. And who are we to decide whether or not someone's going to take a job? You know, I mean,
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And
yeah.
I think, part of what you just articulated there is you're really unraveling that the decisions are being made within this larger system, and how year after year, decade after decade, we have decided that individuals at AAU institutions, which really represent about 65 institutions of higher education out of roughly 3,000 institutions of higher education, that if they don't come from that kind of set of schools, then it's almost impossible for to get them into the structures, into the system. And this becomes a self-replicating process or harm that we're seeing. Is that the most shocking thing that surprised you in your research, or is there something else?
There are a number of things. I would say that, one of the things that is quite shocking is now there's a privileging of these AAU institutions, but I'll tell you it was really disheartening to me is that a lot of people told me, listen, we hire from 6 or 7 institutions and we don't hire from anybody else. And that is really disheartening, even though you might know it happens, right? To hear it is really disheartening because people told me, 5 or 6 institutions, that's all we're really hiring from. Even when I pushed, well, but you realize that these 5 or 6 institutions are not producing a lot of people of color, and you're telling me that you value diversity, so why aren't you looking further? Many people would tell me, I mean, that's what we look to. That's what our faculty is willing to take. So that was difficult. That's a difficult thing to swallow. Another thing I think, and I mentioned this before, but the fact that there are so few, especially African Americans, getting PhDs at AAU institutions in any areas outside of ethnic studies is really hurting African Americans who want to be faculty at these AAU, these heavy research institutions. It's really hurting them because that's how you get in the door. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that's how you get in the door. And so because there aren't that many African Americans getting degrees from AAU institutions, and I would say the Latinx population is kind of also in that situation, but it's not as dire. It's not much is going to change. And the fact that I think people know that it's not going to change, and we're not seeing something being done about that. So, you can only do things in 2 ways. You can either get more African Americans and Latinx folks to get PhDs at AAU institutions if the bias remains, or you can push people to change their definition of what's an acceptable PhD, right? I mean, to broaden their definition of what's acceptable. And I'm not sure which one of those is going to happen first. So that was also kind of shocking. And then I think one of the biggest things was like, I'll tell you, there's a quote that I use in the book on the chapter related to diversity and equality that says, one of the university deans said to me, in academia, you are purposefully vague, so you can't be held accountable for anything. I mean, that right there, and that exemplifies some of the things that I heard. Now, later on, we're going to talk about some of the great things I heard that really work. But I think like initially that was so disheartening, even though I kind of knew that people felt that way. And I will say that part of that goes back to that idea that I heard so many people tell me, yeah, I know there's a problem, but we can't do anything about it. What am I going to do about it? It's not going to change. So that right there, was it surprising? Probably not. It was disheartening, I would say. I will also say that there were lots of good surprises, like things that people had figured out how to do that were really creative, that we'll talk about later on in the questions, but that were really creative and interesting. And I thought, wow, good for you. And it was a whole variety of people doing these things. It wasn't all people of color, although a lot of people of color were doing them. I will say that there were some white folks, even some white men, who had said, you know, enough is enough. I'm not putting up with this anymore. This is what we're going to do. And most of them have had some kind of life-changing incident in their life that really changed them. And because I pushed and asked, you know, why do you have this approach? And it was something that happened in their life that kind of changed things for them. So I would say those are some of the things that I was surprised by and sort of disheartened by.
Yeah, this, I I look forward to us talking a little bit more about some of the positive shocks, as you said, as we go forward. But, as you were speaking, I was just reflecting on the fact that I've been privileged to be mentored by two African-American males in the academy, James Anderson, who you referenced, and now Robert Jones, who's the chancellor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Both went to a historically Black college. In the case of Anderson, it was Stillman. In the case of Chancellor Jones, it was Fort Valley. And here they kind of came up through the ranks and ended up at AAU institutions. But there's such gifts to higher education, on so many different levels. Anybody who's ever met Jim Anderson, for example, knows how much and how many people he has mentored. But one of the things that you talk about over and over again, at least these are two terms that are referenced throughout the book, are quality and pedigree. And I think many people would say Fort Valley, Stillman, they're not of the quality of Harvard or Yale. Yet, no offense to Harvard, I just haven't been mentored by anybody from those two institutions yet. And so, but nonetheless, here's quality and pedigree. And it seems to be, you talk about it a lot. And I was wondering, can you expand on that? Because I have my take as to how they're being perceived, but my own experiences says that it should be broader than the way people are talking about in your book. But can you talk a little bit about those two concepts and how you think we can think differently about them?
Sure. And I did want to say something about James Anderson. And for those of you listening who don't know him, please look him up. He's just an amazing, amazing scholar who is also an amazing practitioner in doing this important work. But, I did an interview with him recently for another book that I was working on recently. And he said such a beautiful thing while we were talking. He said, I went to Stillman College, a Black college, and I was surrounded by brilliance. I was surrounded by some of the smartest people you could ever imagine. And he said, the lie that people tell you is that Black colleges don't have smart people. Right. That smart people don't come out of Black colleges. And I mean, I'm always saying that, but I thought it was just so powerful when he, I didn't have his experience. I didn't go to a Black college. And he just said, one thing that I always keep in mind is that I was surrounded by brilliance, and people tried to tell me I wasn't, but I was. Right. And so that's I think, and that has to do with just quality and right. And how we define things, and right, and who gets to define quality. So right. So thank you for asking that. And one thing I will say is that among these institutions, by and large, quality was defined in two ways: where you went to school for your PhD, and who your advisor was. And for me, I think that's really unfortunate, because that's a really, really narrow definition of quality. And I think it doesn't do us, it does us an injustice, right? So one thing I wanted to do is just quickly read a little passage from the book, sure. Because I tried my best to find a way to explain why it's so important that we think more broadly about quality. And while I was writing the book, what I'm going to read to you happened to me, and then I ended up putting it in the book. So I'll just read this. A professor asked me the following question, and I was asked this during a talk. So he asked me this question: architects are in the business of producing buildings. Plausibly, what's most important is that we have the best producers of buildings, not that the producers be diverse. plausibly, professors are in the business of producing knowledge. Why not care about having the best producers of knowledge? And if they happen to be white, so be it. So there I was, like having just given a talk, and he asked this question, and I responded by saying this: I would argue that we won't know our potential for producing the best buildings, the most beautiful and impressive buildings, unless we are inclusive about who has the opportunity to produce these buildings. If we are more inclusive, we may even expand our definitions and understandings of the best, the most beautiful and impressive buildings. Likewise, I would argue that we don't truly know who the best producers of knowledge are if we aren't inclusive about who has the opportunity to produce knowledge. If we are more inclusive, we may even expand our definitions of the best in terms of the production of knowledge. And I put that in the book because people are really set in their ways of holding on to this idea of, we know how to define quality, and if you're outside of this area, you're not high quality. And I will also tell you that that's the number one thing that comes up when you start talking about diversifying the professoriate. Lo and behold, someone will say, yes, but we don't want to water down the quality. And for me, that is a racist comment, okay? Because why are you assuming that more diversity means lower quality? Right. The only reason you're assuming that is because you've got some racist ideas, right? I mean, you have to. There's no other way to assume that. And so I really wanted people to understand that by not being inclusive, by not giving people full opportunity, we really are limiting our understanding of knowledge, our production of knowledge. We're understanding what we could possibly, we're limiting what we could learn. And so those are some of the things that I talk about in the book. And I will say that I really use Lauren Rivera's Pedigree. Her book, again, I want to recommend it. It's a quick read because it's so good. And I use that as like a frame throughout the book so that people will understand what I mean by quality, what I mean by pedigree. And I want to say that Rivera says something really important, and that is that people who have power, and so she calls them elites, they will, if they notice that, let's say, other people without power are starting to get power, they will redefine the system. They will change the rules so that those people who are like right on the cusp of maybe getting something can't get it anymore. And that's really scary, right? And I mean, I'm sure you've seen this happen in the academy as well. I mean, it definitely happens. I mean, I think some people might think that we're above that, but I don't think that we are. I think that it happens regularly.
Yeah, and you're raising an excellent point, is that, you know, even when we think about terms like quality and pedigree, we don't understand how sometimes we've inherited the definitions of those terms, and they fit within the structures of the way we use those terms, and they make determinations as to who can have access to a job or to a promotion because of the way we use those terms. And it's that epistemology, kind of the inherited epistemology, that leads to the structural forms and systemic forms of racism, of harm, of sexism, when you think about it in these categories, even though you're very targeted in your focus in this book. And I love how you've taken the layers of this kind of way of knowing, or the way of applying these concepts, essentially this epistemology, and how it trickles down into everyday discussions with individuals who are in rooms making decisions as to who is worthy of being hired at this institution, i.e. the selective institutions that you really put tremendous focus around, the AAU institutions. And so, no, it's not, I think everyone probably listening has an anecdote or a story to share. I think the question is, are they willing to share? Because that's really the premise of your book, is to do the right thing, is to share these things so we can be more intentional in upending something that's been a problem than being silent and perpetuating it. And that kind of really leads to my next question, is if we want to make a change, a long-lasting change that breaks down systemic racism in faculty hiring. What should we do?
So great question. And I do want to remind everyone that in these interviews, the only people who I identify are the experts, right? Which are a variety of experts on systemic racism in faculty hiring or retention who I talk to. I had to basically negotiate the interviews with around and people being anonymous. And I want to point that out because I think that's why I was able to get so many candid comments, because people aren't named. And you just alluded to the fact that a lot of people don't want to talk about these things. They're afraid, and sometimes people feel really vulnerable to talk about them. So I will say some things that, some things that leaders can do. Okay, so some of the best approaches that I saw were, number one would be to say to people, before you start a search, I need you to go out and look at the pipeline data. I need you to go to the Survey of Earned Doctorates, and I need you to find out where people are graduating and who's producing, a diverse group of people who could be in our pool. So you got to start with the data. Another thing, make sure that the search committees are as diverse as you can get them to be, keeping in mind that you don't want to overload people of color with those service kinds of requirements. So, white folks need to step up and do this work too. And I would say that you want to make sure, and sometimes this is very controversial, and I have a whole chapter about search committees in here and all the different things that go along with them. But I really do think that implicit bias training is the way to go. I think people need to have that implicit bias training. And I would even say, I think people should be required to have it. In the book, I would say about a third require it. Most don't have it. Some have some haphazard in the middle kind of thing happening. So implicit bias training is really important. Another thing that leaders can do is they can incentivize. They can make it part of, let's say if you're the provost, you can make it part of a dean's annual review process. Some people felt very strongly about holding deans accountable for hiring a diverse faculty. Other people said, you're not going to be a dean with me unless you hire a diverse faculty, so I'm not even going to put it in your performance review. It's a given, right? So people had different views on that. I think one of the most strategic approaches was to just say to people, no, you're not hiring any more white people. You're not going to keep replicating yourself over and over and over. And this was especially a way to approach things in the sciences. It tended to work really well, where deans and sometimes also department chairs, but it was usually deans who said, okay, now listen, you for the past 6 years, you have hired white people in every single search. No more. Either you hire some people of color or you don't get any more colleagues. And what happened is people found people of color because they wanted to spread the work out, and they didn't want to, they wanted more colleagues to be able to spread the work out. So eventually they found people of color. What was interesting is in those places where the dean just put their foot down and said, I'm not letting you hire any more people and replicate yourself, people started to find people of color year after year. It was amazing. It was like they just came out of nowhere, right? And then another thing that happened was in some, especially in the sciences, not only, people tended to think that the only institutions that produced high quality individuals were the institutions where they went to school. And this is where I went back to Lauren Rivera, who says, most people define quality according to what they think quality is. And she uses a really good example. She says, if you ask people what makes for a good parent, okay, they normally will tell you everything about themselves. Okay, like they'll tell you all the things that they wish they were or all the things that they do. And it's the same thing with what is quality. People will determine that based on who they are. So in a lot of these departments, what was happening is people, if they had gone to MIT, they were only hiring people from MIT. If they had gone to Harvard, that's all they would hire. If they had gone to, let's say, a Big Ten school, they were just hiring Big Ten people, and they wouldn't hire anyone else. And because people tend to feel comfortable with that, they're replicating themselves, and they also people tend to feel more comfortable with someone who looks like them and has similar cultural reference points. So I will say that another thing that I thought was really powerful is not accepting, and I use this word throughout the whole book, laziness. Okay. And I had a couple of friends read the book before I submitted it. And one of them, rightly so, said, "Are you sure you want to use that word?" And I said, well, I do think that faculty are intellectually lazy when it comes to understanding diversity. And the reason why I said that is because, faculty, Chris, if we want to know the answer to something, we will research it like you can't believe. But when it comes to how to hire a diverse faculty, for some reason, people don't want to put in the work, right? So I kind of call that intellectual laziness. And I think that the deans and the provosts and department chairs who said, no, absolutely not. You're going to put in all the work, and I'm not going to let you hire anyone until you put in the work. They got a lot of progress. Now, of course, I also talk about all the academic freedom and shared governance issues in this book, because some people are up in arms about that, thinking, well, it's not your role, right, to tell me. But I think and I wholeheartedly believe in academic freedom. I'm chair of the faculty council at Rutgers. I wholeheartedly believe in it. But I have to say that if your calls for academic freedom are keeping you, and shared governance are keeping you from having a diverse faculty, I don't know if that's the best use of it. So I think that you should be asking yourself, why are we hiring the same people over and over? And I do want to say that there's a great, and I put this in the book. It's by Sensoy and D'Angelo, who do some really, really good work. They published this piece in the Harvard Ed Review that is really, really good about faculty hiring. And one of the things they talk about is, let's say, we're in a department, and that department hires a white person in 2016, a white person in 2017, a white person in 2018, a white person in 2019. People often don't say anything. But if you were to hire a Black person in 2017, a Black person in 2018, a Black person in 2019, right, and keep going, people would be up in arms. They would be absolutely up in arms. And so I put that example in there because I think it's really important for people to realize that we have been hiring and replicating whiteness in the academy as long as it's existed, right? So so I think it's really important to keep in mind that we have to push back at it, and that's when I saw leaders do that, that's a big deal. And then one comment about faculty. So the best thing that faculty can do is to say something about the excuses. So for example, if I'm on a search committee and someone says, Black and brown people, they just don't come here. They're not going to come here. Let's not even extend an offer. It's a waste. They're not going to come here. We've seen that they're not going to come here. If they're not coming to your institution, that's a problem with you as an institution. And the other thing is, why are we trying to think for the candidate? Why are we putting the blame on the candidate, right, rather than looking inward at what we're doing? I think, another excuse I mentioned earlier was, they won't take the job because it doesn't pay enough. Well, it's interesting because the white folks are taking the jobs that they say won't pay enough, which that's an interesting thing, right? So why are we assuming that people of color won't take a job? Why don't we let them make that choice, right? Let folks of color make that choice. So there are lots of excuses like that. Here's another thing. Every time you hear someone say that a Black college, let's say if someone had a PhD from Howard or did their undergrad at Howard, if you hear people say those aren't high quality schools, ask them, how do you know that? Do you have evidence about that? Because one thing about faculty is we like evidence for everything. So we should also have to have evidence for these false claims that we make, right? We should have to have evidence. So as faculty, we need to sort of hold each other accountable for those kinds of things that happen in search committees. It's important, and it's part of a learning process. we all have something to learn, right? We all have something to learn every single day. I don't know about you, but every single
Right.
day. So, yeah.
Why don't people do more of that? I think, to me, this is it's common sense. I feel like you're 100% correct. And we can also go through the conversation to say that more decreased faculty also means more or more increased in diverse faculty also means a more increased and diverse student body, and more increase in diverse appreciative alumni, because they're going to graduate
Mhm.
under new ideas, new people, new exposure. So why don't we do more of what you're saying? Like why, and I have witnessed this, why have faculty sat silent when they know in that moment someone should raise the question to say, hey, what's your evidence on that? That seems more stereotypical than reality. Why don't we do more?
So this is a really good question, and it's a question that I really, really try to get at as well. So I would say there are a couple of things. Number one, people are not brave. They are afraid. They are afraid of what will happen to them personally. And I think that I know as well, that if you speak out about racism, people will come for you. They will come for you. So, and you have to be prepared for that. If you do, you can see the way that people across the country, someone like Nicole Hannah-Jones or Ibram Kendi, how, if you look on Twitter and you just see how people, come for them daily, and many other people too, right? Who come for people daily. People are afraid. They're afraid to do that. Even over the years, I've often wondered, I see a lot of tenured faculty who are afraid. I think part of it is they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to not get a raise. They don't want to, lots of people don't want, I was listening to a book on Audible the other day, and talking about kind of what our fears are in general in life. And it was talking about how most people are afraid of being embarrassed in public, like having some kind of public embarrassment. And so they're afraid of those kinds of things, afraid of people not liking them. A lot of people want to be liked, even faculty. And so they don't speak up. So that's one reason. Another reason is sometimes people, I think it's a little bit more pervasive, and that is that people, they don't really want the status quo to change because it benefits them. So, sometimes when you make change to these systems, when you're trying to undo systemic racism, I mean, you're going to have to give up a little bit because you've been having too much, and I think, so I'm not saying that there's not enough pie for everyone. There is, but sometimes if you've been taking 3 slices of pie, you might have to take 1 slice of pie and give somebody else a slice and another person a slice, and you've been getting too much pie, right? So I think that that's another thing, that people don't want to do that. I also think, and I believe this because of the emails that I received, which, remember when I told you I received roughly, somewhere under 7,000 emails. One of the things, there were about 500 of them that were really, really terrible. And I bring them up because they were talking about how people of color bring the academy down, how knowledge is harmed by people of color, how people of color are not as intelligent, all of these kinds of things, how they water everything down. I mean, that's what the emails were about, right? I won't dignify them with actually saying what they said in specifically, but I will say that there are people who believe that. They wholeheartedly believe that. And then the last thing I think is just kind of laziness. Like we think that if we just say, okay, I want a diverse pool, that it's going to happen. We don't think it takes any work. We don't even look beyond what are called like known networks, right? People we know, our friend circle. We don't look beyond them. We just kind of like put it out there and expect this really, really diverse group of people to come, and they don't, because we don't put the hard work in to do it. And I would say that that idea really comes from Daryl Smith, who talks about how she's like, listen, I know that I should get up off the couch every afternoon and exercise, but do I? Not always, not always. I know it's good for me. I know it would help me live longer. I know that it's the best approach, but I don't do it. I want to do it. I want to do it. And I want the results of it, right? I want to be in good shape. I want to do this. But what she says is most people don't get off the couch. Right. And in this case, I would say a lot of people don't get off the couch.
Right. And I might add, because I appreciate you. That was one of my favorite quotes in the book. And because I thought it just explained so well this notion of motivation, perhaps, as to why people do or don't do what's right in the moment, in that sense. And I looked at that one and I thought about it just a little bit. And I wondered if there was a structured plan. So let's just say, use the exercise as the example. If someone literally built a structured plan of how you can get up off the couch and do 30 minutes of exercise every day and point to these would be the rewards that would happen from doing it, would that change the psychology of how someone would get off the couch to be engaged enough to exercise every day? And so to me, it becomes a question is if provosts worked with deans to build a structure to where faculty going into these searches for hires for faculty, could faculty build a psychology to do what is right in that moment, to ensure that we would get the kind of outcomes that our society, that our institutions of higher education deserve? And I really don't know the answer to that, because I've tried structured plans to get up off the couch and exercise, and they work for about 2 weeks. And then I'm like, I kind of like the way my body looks right now, and so somewhere in there, you lose the motivation, right? So if you could do a TED Talk, and you can do it with all the AAU provosts out there, what would be the handful of things that you might recommend to the provost to say, how do you build that structure and that motivation to undo some of the systemic harms that we keep replicating, as you note in your book?
Well, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that. One thing is, I really think that colleges and universities need to have an honest dialogue with themselves. Like, faculty need to have this dialogue, right? Of why they are privileging certain institutions. And I'll just give you a funny example of this. I gave a talk a few years ago where I was at a small, fairly prestigious college, and I talked to them. They were telling me, listen, we can't water down quality by going to these other institutions because our faculty won't be as good, and it's really important that we have faculty from the very best institutions. So I said, okay, well, how about if we go around the room and everybody tell me where they got their PhD? And we went around the room, and guess what? There was only one Ivy League PhD in the room. But
was
they
that
were
you?
all, what?
No, you went to Indiana.
No.
That's not Ivy League, trust me.
I went
I'm at Illinois. I know that's not Ivy League.
Yeah. No, there was only one Ivy League PhD in the room. And the thing is, they were all trying to hire Ivy League PhDs for their faculty. And I said to them, why are you doing that? Like, everybody here has gone to all these different types of institutions, and you told me that you're such a high quality institution. So why are you only privileging? Because they told me they couldn't find any Ivy League people of color. That's not true, by the way, either. But they basically, I said, well, why did the people of color have to only go to Ivy Leagues, but you were all able to go to these other institutions? Now, they couldn't answer that. Okay, they looked at themselves like, what the heck, because they couldn't answer it. So I guess one thing I would say is we have to have a conversation about why we are privileging a set of institutions that, maybe 65 major research institutions as the only institutions that can prepare faculty. And in the book, I actually have a list of all the Research 1 institutions, all the Research 2 institutions, and then like the next level of research institutions. And, here's an example. Georgetown is not one of these 65 institutions, right? And most people would say, oh, well, that's a really good institution. There's a whole variety of institutions that aren't part of that group. that are producing PhDs, and a lot of them have a lot of people of color. One thing that I do is I show the diversity of those other beyond the 65 institutions that are research one institutions, and there's a lot more diversity. So why aren't we looking, beyond these institutions? And ask yourself, I think they really need to say, why are we doing this when we know that it's keeping people out? And we also know that our own PhD programs are not very diverse. So the problem is not going to go away no matter how much money we throw at it, and no matter how much we talk about it. So that's one thing. Another thing, and I want to go back to, you got to confront the excuses. You've got to have a system in place where people, and you can do it by saying, I hear you. Let me educate you a little bit, and help people to understand why these excuses that they use over and over and over just really are myths, are not true. That's an important thing to do. I think using pipeline data is so important. Pipeline data will help you change the minds of faculty who are a little more stuck, because once they see the pipeline data, it's hard for them to argue. I think that's really important. I think you also have to admit that there are biases in this process. One of the things that I talk about, I quote one of the provosts, and he basically was saying, these institutions, the hiring processes were set up for white men during like the 1950s. And we're still using the same hiring processes that really have sexism in them. They have, there's ableism in them. There's racism in them. There's all of these kinds of things, classism, right? That we really need to have a discussion about and rethink. And that's there in the last chapter of this book has a call to action. And I really try to get people, I put like all kinds of ideas for how you can do things differently. And some of those are based on my read of the literature. Some are based on my interviews. Some are based on, what might have come out of my own brain. And so I, put a lot of different things in there. But those are some of the big things that I would tell people. And I think you also have to, one thing I will say is that the institutions where the call for, we are absolutely going to have a diverse faculty at the top. When it's at the top with the president and provost, it makes a huge difference. If you hear them acknowledging the biases and the racism in the system for hiring, and they say, we're going to change things and we're going to make sure that happens, it tends to happen. One of the best examples is Ruth Simmons at Brown University. I mean, Brown actually is one of the more diverse institutions out there in this AAU group. And I really think that a lot of that is attributable to Ruth Simmons, who really, really pushed to have a more diverse faculty. And you can see, if you look back through the numbers, the change from when she became president and then afterward. There are just fundamental changes in who is faculty at the institution.
No, that's an excellent point. And I was just about to ask you a question, if you could talk us through an example of what you think works, right? And I love the Ruth Simmons example, but are there others that you would share to where you could say, yeah, of all the things that I've seen or research in this book, what are examples in your mind that work?
Well, one example, and this does get used, it is used at a variety of places, but I mean, I would say I would go to your institution and the work that James Anderson and Bill Trent and yourself did around, which is really good institutional work. And for those of you who don't know, Chris, which I cite in the book, wrote this great piece about like how they were able to develop a cohort of faculty of color and really like build out an area to be incredibly diverse and to be incredibly strong. And then to also, at the very same time that they were building out this cohort of faculty of color, and basically in the ed school, and I think a lot of this caught on at your institution, but they were also building out a cohort of PhDs of color, right? And have produced so many people who have gone on to be faculty at other places and who are doing the same kind of work because they were kind of brought into the academy valuing the contributions of people of color. And so I think that if you can kind of work on those two areas together and really think about it as a cohort, it makes it a lot easier than for people who are just there by themselves, because it's really, really hard. Now, I'm not a person of color, but I do understand what it's like to be when I'm the only woman in a room. I do understand that. And I understand what it's like to have people talk over me, get me to try to send the Zoom links, get me to try to take all the notes, get me to do all of those things. And similar things, and much worse, are happening with people of color who are the only person. Sometimes they're ignored, they're excluded, they're not brought into the fold. They're not everyone's not on board for ensuring that people are going to do their best. If you have a cohort, it sort of changes things. So I think the cohort model is a good one. And then the other thing I would say is that I really, really like the model of you're going to bring me a diverse pool and diverse final candidates. Otherwise, we're not going to move forward with the search. And because the thing is, there are people out there. There are people out there. And I'll tell you a little story. About 8 years ago, I was on a dissertation committee for a young Black man, and who went to very prestigious institutions. And so I was on his dissertation committee 8 years ago. For 8 years, he has tried to get a job. He has degrees from 3 of the most prestigious institutions in the country. For 8 years, he has tried to get a job, okay, in the area of business. While I was writing the book, and in the book, you'll see that I don't name him, but I talk about this as an example, and I note that he still doesn't have a job. I have to tell you that this is so ironic, but the day that I received my copy of my book, he called to tell me that he just got a job. And you know what? He got a job after all of this crap that we've seen happen in the country, right? He finally got a job. And I've been serving as a reference all this time for him, watching him. He's prolific. He has so many articles, and he could not get a job. And he's in an area where there aren't a lot of African-American men who are with PhDs in business, who are, trying to get jobs in the area where he has a background in sort of econ and business. There aren't a lot of African-American men. So I cannot figure out, I know why, right? I know why he didn't get the job, but he did get a job the other day. And I'm so excited for him. But I will say that holding people's feet to the fire around these issues it's important. I mean, you need leaders who are going to stand up and do that.
No, you raise an excellent points, and I appreciate the shout out at the University of Illinois. I, again, feel privileged to have been a part of that longstanding process. And Jim Anderson, in particular, in his efforts to institutionalize diversity at the University of Illinois. One thing our university has just recently done is also added in its communication number 9 for promotion and tenure that everyone has to submit a diversity statement, and are now taking into consideration for promotion and tenure your efforts to enhance diversity across the campus in the 3 core areas, teaching, research, and service/public engagement. And so there are ways that you can begin to be more intentional, as you're saying, to build cohorts or to build consequences and rewards in order to begin to achieve the kind of outcomes that we would like to see. I know we only have a handful of minutes left, and so and I want to say clearly, I know this book was written about hiring. And I'm sure there are probably people in the Q&A that are asking questions, well, what about professional development and retention and these other growth points for anybody who's in the academy, right? So if the book is about hiring, and we know retention is important as well, when are we going to see your next book on these matters?
Well, that would take a while, because I feel like, even though I try to stay up to date on there's a really wonderful, rich not history, but rich literature of faculty retention, especially folks of color. And a lot of it is done by folks of color, really, really amazing people. And I do have a small section near the end of the book that says, you know, it doesn't matter if you hire people, if you don't do these things, you're not going to be able to keep them. But it would take me a while, because this book took me 5 years to write. So it took me like a while to research and then a couple years to write. But what I would say is that I think with regard to retaining people, one of the best things that you can do is that you can demystify the process of, for example, of getting tenure. You can stop making it so secretive, stop making it so ambiguous, stop, you know, with all, why aren't there clear objectives and goals that you have to reach? Why is it, well, you know, we know it when we see it, right? Why are we operating that way when what is much more fair to people and equitable is if we state exactly what people need to do, if we give people equitable resources to do the work. And, you know, I also think it's important that not only people of color, but that white folks are expected to do the work of advising students of color, of, you know, understanding issues that are important to related to diversity, which I'm really glad you brought up the use of diversity in tenure, because, you know, sometimes people will say, well, that's not fair, I don't do diversity work. Okay, you might not do research related to it. You know, let's say that's not your area of research, you're doing something related to, I don't know, cancer or something, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be making sure that you have diversity in your lab. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be thinking about different learning styles in your classroom, or, you know, really understanding how students learn. That's the kind of thing that, again, I would say we're a little lazy about, right? We don't always do that work. So I think everybody needs to be responsible for those kinds of things. I also think that there needs to be clarity in terms of, there needs to be assigned mentors. There need to be formal and informal mentors. There need to be central types of supports and also school level and department supports. I also think that there should be regular interactions between faculty of color and their either department chair or deans around the experiences that they're having. And if they're not having positive experiences, well, then you got to figure out how to make those experiences more positive. And I mean, I think we need to be a lot more caring and careful about crafting positive and really meaningful experiences for faculty, and especially faculty of color. For me, the biggest thing is demystifying all of these things, because we make it like a big secret where the only way you find out is if you have a whole bunch of social capital, and it's about who you know and how you can get information. And unfortunately, that we know that people of color have less social capital. We know that people from low income backgrounds have less social capital, right? So we're kind of hiding the secrets to success from people, and then wondering, well, why aren't they as successful as I wanted them to be? So.
Well, I will say this, that one, if we have to wait 5 years, then so be it. We'll wait 5 years for the next book, but we appreciate the pearls of wisdom in the meantime. But I'm going to shift a little bit here, because I'm in 100% agreement with you that we should make diversity core to the business of what we do. Just as much as we know how much is in our budgets, whether we're a faculty person or an administrator or an executive leader, we should also have a sense as to how we are fully engaged in our efforts around DEI work. And so, Marybeth, I can't thank you enough. And these are my questions. And what I'd like to do now is open it up to the questions that we have here. And it popped up a little bit different from me. And so I'm going to start the process of reading through them and seeing how you might be able to answer them.
Sure.
Let me see here. I see a question here. It says, can you further give some advice as to what a person can or should do when they want to diversify their faculty and staff? But do you really have to put, I'm trying to read this with my bifocals here, so I apologize, really have to put a huge burden on your new hires to be the change. And so essentially, you're a new hire yourself, and now you've been put on a search committee to hire more new people. And now, what advice would you give to those individuals as they're now going through the process of trying to seek the organizational change, the diversity change that you're asking about, but they're new themselves? They're probably some of the most vulnerable people in the department. What advice would you give to them with regards to being in that situation?
So that's a really good question. And it's a really, really tricky thing. It's sort of a little bit of a tightrope. And I would say that if you're on a search committee and you are a new faculty member, and let's say you're on the tenure track, but you're untenured, right? You're assistant professor. Unfortunately, you have to be a little careful in the academy, and I hate even saying that, but you have to be a little careful about what you say. And so I will tell you, one of the things that I have really tried to do, especially in recent years, is if I'm on a committee with untenured folks, and knowing that I'm a full professor and have an endowed chair and I'm a distinguished professor, I'm very cognizant that I let all of them talk first. I don't say anything. I just listen, just sit back and listen, because you have to think about the fact that you need to sit back and see, maybe things have changed, right? Maybe the world is being looked at a little bit differently. And I know when I sit back and listen, and most of our assistant professors in my school at Rutgers are young people of color. And I like to sit back and listen, and I like to see how they think about things theoretically, what's important to them, what they're looking for in a colleague. And maybe it's not as important for me to get what I want in a colleague. Maybe it's more important for them to get what they want in a colleague. And so in terms of how the person thinks about ideas, how they're going to contribute. And so I think one thing when you're on those committees, if there is a committee where there's, let's say you're an assistant professor and there's someone who you trust who happens to be tenured, maybe ask them, what's the best way for me to interact on this committee? Is there anything that I need to be careful of? Because I do think in the academy sometimes there are. I would also say, we always have to pick our battles. So I don't think you should battle everything, but think about the things that are really, really important to you, and pick those battles. But, and Chris, you know Joy Williamson-Lott, who I think she's now a dean at the University of Washington, but is a wonderful historian, one of my absolute favorite historians. And I once heard her give a talk where she said, every morning I get up and I think to myself, I'm going to say what's on my mind, but I know that there are always ramifications to what I say, right? So I think you always have to realize that if you're going to speak up and you're going to push back, there might be some ramifications. And what she said was, I have to figure out whether or not I'm willing to deal with those ramifications. So am I open to dealing with those ramifications? And if you're not, then don't do it. Don't do it. And I would say, I wish that the academy was not like this, but I do think that I know as an assistant professor, I was nervous sometimes about speaking up. After a couple of years, I wasn't as nervous. I realized that at the end of the day, I had some other skills. I'm good at photography. I like design. I'm a good fundraiser. And if I really needed to do something else, I could. And I tried to think about it that way because I didn't want to live in fear constantly. And so it is hard though. And Chris, I'd be interested in your comment on that too, because you've been an associate dean as well. And I'm sure that you've seen those kinds of things and been in those situations. So it's tricky.
Oh yeah, it's beyond tricky. And I would share that, there's Dr. Lott Williamson is correct. Unfortunately, you have to think about what you say before you say it. I always tell people sometimes there's some groups that have to ask and answer questions that others don't have to ask and answer. And when you're in that position, that's already challenging. Then you compound it by being a person of color in a leadership position, and everything gets scrutinized at that point. And you could be 98% on the side of the people who you're working for, and width, but they'll only remember the 2% where you had disagreement forever.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so it's always a complicated thing in this regard. But I think the advice you just gave to those who are assistant professors in these situations is beyond invaluable. I see another question here, and I'm going to try to combine it. The question says, do you think that perhaps including the rankings and reputations of departments, that in the rankings and reputations of departments, that diversity should be included as a factor? And I know you spoke a little bit about this in your book, but I was hoping you could speak a little bit more to that based on the question. And then as a part two to that question, knowing that if, let's just say, we did or don't include these rankings, demanding diverse pools of applicants or using diversity statements and other strategies, these are actually coming under attack in many states across the nation. Any ideas on how to combat this? And so I wanted to combine those two questions.
Those are really good questions. And so one of the things that I do in the book that we didn't talk that much about today, but I really do try to get people to reframe the whole definition of excellence that you hear everywhere. And for me, I don't think any college or university is excellent unless it's diverse. Someone can't convince me of that, because how can you say your institution is excellent, which all kinds of colleges and universities do, and it's not diverse because it doesn't include the contributions of a whole variety of individuals, right? And it's also not an equitable place to work. And so I guess one of the things I would say is absolutely, I think that I have mixed feelings about rankings, but I would say I think that rankings should include the diversity of the faculty and the diversity of the students. I think that's incredibly important. I also think that we should probably not give as much credence to rankings as we do. But again, expanding the definition of excellence and only like, to me, excellent, you're only excellent if you're diverse. That's how I feel about it. Thank you for the question about the diversity statements and the using pipeline data. I have a whole chapter about diversity statements in hiring in the book. And one of the things that I did while I was writing the book, there was a huge Twitter storm on diversity statements that took place. Somebody who was a former, I think, dean at Harvard Med School had put something on Twitter, and it just went, crazy. So I downloaded, I don't know, somewhere like 120 tweets, and I did an analysis of them. That's another data source that I have in here, is I look at things like that as well. And I did an analysis of them, and it was really, really interesting because most people think that were complaining about the diversity statements, they feel like it's a litmus test. Like if they don't answer it properly, that they're not going to get the job. And I will say that all of the people who commented on that, I also looked, I looked up various things about folks because it's public, right? And most of those were white men that were commenting. I will say that there were other people who were white men who said, wait a minute, I mean, in this diversity statement, all you got to do is talk about how you're making contributions that enable a whole variety of people to learn or to have opportunity, or maybe how your work speaks to that. So it's not really that difficult of a thing to do. And, I'm wondering why you wouldn't be willing to do it. So they are very, very controversial. I will say that I think that we're going to see more and more, especially at public institutions, especially in states that have legislatures that are very conservative. I think you're going to see more and more sort of people making inroads into the universities and trying to control hiring processes, control how people are hired. I don't think pipeline data there won't be much of an impact there because, I don't know how you can argue with pipeline data. It's just a fact. I mean, people graduated, that's a fact. And they got PhDs, that's a fact. I think where you might see some pushback is in saying to people, okay, you can't hire another white person to replicate yourself over and over and over again. There may be some pushback there. And I also think that scholars who do work on systemic racism are also there's going to be pushback not to hire them, right? We're already seeing some of that. People who teach about systemic racism talk about it. I mean, I was mentioning before we got started today that since my book came out, I've received, like, I don't know, like in the past week, like about 6 or 7 emails that are absolutely vile about how basically why we shouldn't have people of color as faculty. And so, I'm used to that because I've seen it happen so many times, and I've been on the receiving end of those kinds of things. But when you write about systemic racism and you remind people of how our nation has really put these systems in place that hurt people of color, they get really mad. And you see this all over the country with faculty and researchers being attacked for basically telling the truth from my perspective. Chris, I don't know if you want to comment on that as well. But
Well, I know I'm looking at the clock
the
here.
time, yes.
I was told there's a hard stop at 1:30.
All right.
And so I don't want to mess
Okay.
with the powers that be. But I do think that you summarized it well. Beyond that point, I will say we could potentially have time for one more question, but
Okay.
a short response.
We'll do it quick. Yep.
And the question I see here is this person works within faculty recruitment, but once he says many of their colleagues are not well versed in diversity and development. How best would you suggest this person makes the topic palatable and encourage more implementation of inclusive practices in his efforts?
Well, I think it's best to put together maybe a document that doesn't include any jargon. So I would take all jargon out, right? I don't have any jargon in this book because I don't believe in writing with it. So, and one of the things is like write a document that takes people through. And if you look at the book, it has like steps where you can like actually all the steps you can take to make sure that you hire a diverse faculty. There's all kinds of questions you can ask yourself. You could create a document. I didn't do that for people, but you could create a document that's really, really straightforward, that's pretty short, and that helps people to have a better understanding of how to do this. And I would couch it that way. I would say, I want to help you to do a better job rather than sort of slapping people on the hand, because you're not going to get them to do anything. I would try to get them to talk about it in terms of a learning process. That's how I would approach that. And if that person wants to contact me, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that and give some examples.
No, excellent. Well, I want to start to give closure to this fantastic discussion. I feel privileged to have been able to be a moderator and a panelist and to be able to ask Marybeth these questions. I want to thank Marybeth for writing this fantastic book. I have my copy here. I wanted to show everybody what they're in store for. I want to thank the Proctor Institute for allowing us to have this conversation and being a sponsor for this event. I want to thank Princeton University or Princeton Press, University Press, for publishing this important book. And most importantly, I want to thank the attendees for showing up and being part of this conversation, as well as asking just fantastic questions. Marybeth, I can't thank you any more than I possibly can for this privilege to work with you. And I don't know if you want to have a closing remark, but with that, I would say thank you, and I've enjoyed this conversation.
All right, thank you. And I would just ask people to go out and try to, do good work and create opportunities for people. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Excellent. Take care.